just checked every one of them.
I said most leaders are under a lot of stress and pressure.
Yeah.
So a lot of them will show anxiety, depression at different times. A lot of leaders will have some affliction at different times because of the pressure and demands of the office.
Did you see Dr. Phil on The View? Joy Behar was all set to tear into Trump, but Dr. Phil calmly turned the tables, hinting that narcissistic traits might be closer to home than she'd like to admit. By the end, Joy was visibly rattled. Isn't it time someone exposed The View's bias?
If you take out everybody that has any of those characteristics, then you're going to take out a lot of people, including some at this table.
Dr. Phil's appearance on The View turned into one of those rare TV moments when a voice of reason disrupts the usual, predictable agenda. It all started innocently enough, with Dr. Phil joining the table to discuss various mental health topics. But it quickly spiraled into a classic showdown. Joy Behar and her co-hosts seemed primed to turn the conversation towards Donald Trump, with Joy especially eager to paint him as the poster child for narcissism. You could almost see her rubbing her hands in anticipation, ready to check off each supposed narcissistic trait that Trump embodies. But Dr. Phil wasn't having any of it.
People talk about narcissism, but they don't really know what it means. So I brought a list from the DSM-5 about what narcissism really is.
Dr. Phil, being the level-headed psychologist that he is, came prepared with a balanced professional approach. He even brought along the DSM-5 criteria for narcissism, the actual psychological checklist used to diagnose the disorder, not some made-up internet description. This was his way of saying, let's stick to facts, shall we? His approach was clear. Let's talk about what narcissism truly is, not just use it as a convenient label to bash someone without any scientific basis. It was obvious that he was steering the conversation away from the partisan game Joy and the others wanted to play, and that didn't sit well with them.
One has a grandiose sense of self-importance.
Check.
Check. Okay.
Next.
2 is preoccupied with fantasies of success, power, or brilliance, which you said. Check.
What made this moment especially satisfying to watch was how unprepared Joy Behar seemed for Dr. Phil's straightforward, no-nonsense style. She was all set to play her usual Trump is a narcissist card. But Dr. Phil reminded her that narcissism isn't just a Trump thing. It's a complex personality trait that can show up in anyone, including those sitting at the table. You could see Joy's smile freeze as she realized she was no longer in control of the narrative. Dr. Phil subtly implied that if we were to remove everyone with narcissistic traits from positions of power, we'd be eliminating a whole lot of people, maybe even a few around that very table. Dr. Phil's approach on The View was a masterclass in calm, fact-based analysis, something we rarely see on mainstream talk shows these days. While the hosts, especially Joy Behar, seemed eager to pin every single narcissistic trait on Donald Trump, Dr. Phil decided to go a different route. Rather than fueling their obvious agenda, he pulled out the DSM-5 criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, the actual traits psychologists use to make a clinical diagnosis. This wasn't just clever, it was a checkmate that brought the conversation back to solid ground.
Okay, 3, believes that he or she is special or unique.
Check.
Can only be understood by special people. 4, requires excessive admiration.
Oh, check.
Now, the DSM-5 criteria aren't just a casual list of personality quirks. They're detailed, science-backed traits that mental health professionals rely on to diagnose real cases of narcissism. As Dr. Phil went through the criteria, he pointed out characteristics like grandiose sense of self-importance, preoccupation with fantasies of success or brilliance, and lack of empathy. Calmly and methodically, he checked them off, explaining that these are the actual signs of narcissism. He didn't do this in a way that painted Trump as the villain they wanted him to be. Instead, he presented the facts. This was no sensationalized list aimed at taking someone down. It was a reality check, plain and simple. Then came Dr. Phil's bold point. If we were to disqualify every person in leadership with even a hint of these traits, we'd be taking out a lot more than just Donald Trump. And he didn't just mean people in Washington or the corporate world. He subtly hinted that there might even be people at that very table who displayed some of these traits. You could almost see the smirks freeze on the hosts' faces, especially Joy's. This wasn't the narrative they'd been hoping for. Dr. Phil had flipped the script, showing that narcissistic traits aren't limited to one person or one side of the political aisle. He was basically saying, let's be real here. Plenty of people, leaders especially, have these characteristics. Joy's reaction was priceless. For someone who loves dishing it out, she seemed visibly uncomfortable when Dr. Phil's words turned the mirror around. She'd been so eager to use that DSM list to label Trump, yet here was Dr. Phil suggesting that these traits could be found much closer to home. You could almost feel her frustration as Dr. Phil refused to play along with the usual View narrative. Instead of piling on Trump as the resident villain, he was educating the audience on the complexities of narcissism, making it clear that it's not a simple label to slap on someone you don't like.
You mean like when he makes fun of people who are handicapped or
I'm just
disabled?
reading it. You interpret it however you want. Is often envious of others or believes that others are envious of him or her, shows arrogant and haughty behavior.
The brilliance of Dr. Phil's approach was that he didn't get riled up or defensive. He stayed calm, methodical, and let the facts speak for themselves. It was as if he knew that any hint of emotion or bias would just add fuel to the fire. By sticking to the DSM-5 criteria and refusing to single out anyone based on politics alone, he brought a refreshing dose of reason to a space often dominated by partisanship and drama. He reminded everyone, including those at the table, that mental health is far too complex to be reduced to a simple weapon in a media battle. Joy Behar's reaction to Dr. Phil's calm, clinical breakdown of narcissism was, in a word, predictable. She had walked into this conversation fully armed, ready to aim every trait in the DSM-5 checklist directly at Donald Trump. From the moment Dr. Phil began laying out the characteristics, you could see Joy's face light up with an eagerness to check off each box for Trump. It was almost like she had been waiting for this moment to label him as the textbook example of narcissism, a label she could casually toss around with full confidence on live TV. But here's where it got interesting. The harder she tried to box Trump in as a narcissist, the more she ended up revealing about herself and, arguably, the very nature of The View. Joy's zeal to brand Trump with every trait listed, from a grandiose sense of self-importance to a need for excessive admiration, actually highlighted traits that might hit closer to home than she'd realized. Think about it. Every point she was so eager to attribute to Trump could easily describe countless public figures, celebrities, and yes, maybe even some talk show hosts who sit at a table every day, speaking to millions of viewers and basking in the applause of their audience. You don't need to be a psychologist to see that these traits aren't exclusive to Trump or any one person in power. In fact, in a profession where success often depends on public admiration and an inflated sense of self, these traits are practically par for the course.
Let me tell you something about Donald Trump. Let me tell you something about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is one of the most generous people you'll ever meet. He does all kinds of things that people have no idea about. And by the way, if he were selfish, he'd take his money and tell all of us to go F ourselves.
And let's be honest, Joy wasn't thrilled with the turn of events. You could see her discomfort growing as it became apparent that Dr. Phil wasn't going to play along with her usual narrative. He had essentially taken away her favorite weapon by turning the conversation into a mirror, one that could reflect the same criticisms back onto anyone exhibiting these traits, not just Trump. It was like he was saying, sure, Trump may have some narcissistic traits, but so do a lot of people, including some around this table. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.